Jacob here. We have Philoso-folly. For this debate, Jacob's going to be taking the position that astrology is sacred science. Philoso-folly is taking the opposition, and as always, winner will be based upon who concedes. No concession is made. We'll put it to a voting poll in which the audience can decide on who they think performed better in the debate. There's no time limit for the debate, but I will remind them when we approach the hour threshold. You guys can get started.
Hey, thanks so much, Philoso-folly, for agreeing to debate this topic.
Yeah, definitely.
So do you want me to sort of try to lay my case out here and you can attack it, or do you have anything you want to say?
You can go ahead and do your opening statement. I have something prepared just to kind of like lay out like the position I'll be coming at it from. But you're in favor of the proposition, so I think you should get to speak first. I don't want to like poison the well for you or anything.
Awesome. So what I intend to do here today is show that our current model of science cannot provide a univocal explanation for reality. That the phenomena of reality is so wide and diverse that to take a scientist position, a position of scientism towards it, to say that the only truth is discovered and discoverable by science, is not a position that you can rationally hold. Furthermore, I think that you could argue in such a way to promote alternative explanations. One of them that I'm using as an example for the purposes of this debate is astrology. I think that the medieval, ancient, and otherwise sort of hermetic version of astrology that survives right up into today's newspaper columns and relationship advice, psychic readers, provides an alternative model of explanation that is, in a sense, just as explanatory. Perhaps not as useful, that could be debated, but does provide a coherent world that we can explore and come to understand. And furthermore, that our scientific view, which we take to be rational and perhaps in conflict with this astrological position, is actually formulated historically out of just such a position. That modern science is in some way an outgrowth of Hermetic magic and the pursuit of alchemy during the Middle Ages. So we can see, in fact, all of these things under the light of, in some ways, this astrological worldview, which might seem a little bit counterintuitive. You might not immediately agree to, but I think that through this debate, we can show is coherent and provides an explanation just as rational, just as valuable. And, I don't think we should shove it aside with saying that it's just completely pointless. So that would be my opening sort of framing of this debate. If I wanted to go on, I just ask you this question that might sort of frame things further. Certainly you would agree there is influence from the planets and the heavenly bodies on Earth. We can see the moon affects the tides. The moon affects women's menstrual cycles, their moods. The sun affects the seasons, which affect all things. All things, in the words of Hermes Trismegistus, have their time. And I think if we open ourselves up to the wisdom of the ancients, open ourselves up to the heavenly efflusions from above, we can come to reinvest this sacred knowledge with meaning and make it work again for us in this modern time. Thank you.
Okay. So just before I say anything, I just wanted to clarify to make sure I'm understanding you correctly. So what I got was science cannot provide an explanation for everything in the universe, right? Like science is limited in its explanatory power. You would say we could turn to things like astrology or things that we would typically not consider to be science to like offer additional explanations. Is that correct?
Yes, that truth is not something that only science has claim to. That truth and understanding can exist outside the scientific domain, that what we consider modern rational science is itself an outgrowth of this earlier spiritual attempt to understand nature as the body of God.
Okay. Cool. I just wanted to make sure that I was on the same page with you. So what I view as being the essential issue in this debate is how we ought to define science, both as like an activity that people do and like a discipline, like as a community. Just to clarify, like I don't actually have any interest in debunking astrology, and nor do I think that astrology cannot provide value to a person's life, right? Like I think that if you are a person who gets a lot of value out of, I don't know, checking your horoscope every day, it provides you, good feelings, allows you to live your life in a way that you find to be productive. I don't want to take that from you. My only project in this discussion is to make the case that astrology fails to meet our functional definition of what constitutes science, right? So like, not to say that it has no value whatsoever, simply that the way we ought to define science would exclude things like astrology from the conversation. But it can exist in its own space. So
Great. So I think that's a great thing to argue about. So can you provide sort of a understanding or definition of science now?
Yeah, I was actually just about to get to that. So the position I'm offering is in part a product of Karl Popper's falsification principle. So that states that for a discipline to be considered scientific in nature, its prescriptions have to be testable and disprovable. So like the theories that a discipline advances have to be falsifiable. Additionally, I'm going to offer the prescription that science like has to take place like in a community, which is like subject to things like open discussion and like evaluation of like a study or like a theory's methodology, right? Like there has to be like the ability for us to test these theories and like falsify them like in a community setting. It can't all just be like the project of like one
right. And that does
individual or
sound
something.
good. That does sound good. But there are problems with falsifiability, right?
Absolutely.
That you can't, if you you're looking for a statement that will falsify your theory, you can't know if the observation that you've just made falsifies your theory or you've made an incorrect observation.
Certainly, which is why I think the greater community, which is where I think the greater community actually comes in to help with this, right? Like you can have like these independent groups working on the same theory, and if it's like consistently coming up falsified, like at the very least, that means that theory is subject to change, right, or like modification in some way. So the
Sure, and
positive
that's a
case,
very sort of like modest claim, and I wouldn't want to deny that claim, but certainly that leaves a lot of room. And why are you not including in that community uh, scientists such as Isaac Newton, who would, in fact, be devoted to certain occult principles? And in fact, his entire notion of gravity was formulated as an occult force, similar to the stare of a basilisk, or the evil eye of a witch, or
certainly.
fog.
So I think that we can look to an example like Isaac Newton. However, like if Isaac Newton is the only one that ever said this, and then like it was not testable or had no possibility of being falsified, I don't think that we would consider that science, right? Like it's considered science because Isaac Newton put this theory forward. We have clear criteria on like how to test the things that he said, right? Like we certainly don't accept everything that Isaac Newton says. Like he was a very
Sure.
prominent alchemist as well. Like he actually considered that to be his main project in his life, the thing that he devoted more of his time to. We don't
Indeed.
we
And
don't
to, I
respect we
would
don't
say,
respect most of those.
sure, but I would say to separate them would be to put back our own methodologies onto that behavior. that what Isaac Newton was doing when he was translating or looking through the prophecies in the book of Revelation and doing his alchemy, which is what he spent literally most of his time doing, was continuous with his work in optics and physics. And what for us is valuable in that work couldn't exist, I would argue, without the hermetic ideas, these mystical ideas that he was steeped in. The very concept of an occult force was seen by Leibniz at the time as just such sort of Gnosticism, right? Or from a Cartesian perspective, you have essentially corpuscles like bouncing into one another, matter in motion. But certainly there could be no great force that's acting at a distance in such a world, right? Descartes had to use vortices to explain the motion of the stars. But Newton refers to this occult force, that which he sees as proof of God's existence. He holds a certain sort of spiritual reverence for, and does not speak to its nature. He can only speak to its effects.
Well, certainly, I think that one of the things, though, and I don't think that it's fair to say like we can never like draw inspiration from other areas, right? Like I think things like the Bible and like religion, like obviously influence science, right? Like science often or typically tends to the questions that we're even asking tend to be ones that are like popular like in the broader culture, right? However, I think there is a difference there from saying like we are drawing inspiration from this other world and doing what I view your project as doing, which is saying like this is all one thing, right? Like I do think that there is a line of demarcation here. We might be able to draw things from many different worlds. However, like when we are talking about like what is science specifically, I think that this idea of testability and like replication, like in this community setting, is what is
But
what is the demarcating point.
But let's look at where that exact facet emerges.
Well, so,
And it is within the context of ritual magic within Hermeticism. You look at people like Marsilio Ficino during the Renaissance period. Their ritual magics were what then like became for like Roger Bacon this revelatory experience. You can't in empiricism simply sort of just go out in an Aristotelian sense and observe. No. You have to have a repeatable, consistent, ritualized experience that the viewer stands in front of and has a part. As you said, there's like a social aspect to it. So I would say that even this, which you say like this is the test for science, this itself is emerged as this mystical ritual, right, where the things all variations, all externalities were mitigated against. So like the very thing that they were looking for could come forth, right, in either an alchemical sense or in a magical sense.
Certainly. But I feel like we're kind of going in a circle here, right? Where I'm saying like it is fine that we draw inspiration. Like there's obviously historically been these influences from these other areas. I don't think modern science, we should say that these are all the same thing. Like they might have come, like the way we ritualize certain things might have certainly been very influenced by something like, Catholic rituals or something like that in like the Middle Ages. That is not the same as saying like Catholic rituals constitute science today. Right.
Sure, I think that is a valid point, and I will acknowledge that. I do want to sort of, I guess, specify one thing though, that I don't think like science is to a certain extent an outgrowth of religion and like the sort of the Thomasian Aquinian notion that there are two books, right? There's the book of the Bible, and then there's the book of nature, right? So it does come from that in a sense, but I would say it also comes from this repressed idea during the Middle Ages, that idea of Hermeticism, which is sort of like a Platonic philosophy that was seen as heretical to a large extent. Maybe in the Renaissance, there was like an attempt to incorporate Hermeticism into the church, and then after that sort of failed, and it was seen as heretical. So what is influencing here science, the birth of science, is not necessarily just the overall culture, the dominant culture of the church, and like everyone is influenced by their environment. But no, it was more of a radically subversive element within culture that was like hidden, and that
Yeah.
through these letters they all like communicated in like coded documents. You have people like the abbot Tristemius, who was like an abbot, but he also pioneered codes and how to encode documents so that they couldn't be written, or sorry, couldn't be read easily and
hmm
spied upon. So you have people like this who are what are going to lay the very foundations for the scientific revolution, and are literally the same people doing the same tasks. Like, so I know you want to distinguish it, but without like a really good definition of science, you can't really do it, right? Because there's no essence of science. There's no like true scientific method. There's no like, this is what science is. To say that is to put yourself into this very hermetic concept from which it was born, which sees science as like the discovery of the philosopher's stone, that
hmm
we're going to reunite matter with spirit and undo
Certainly.
the fall. Yeah.
Certainly, right. And I'm not a person who I mean, I'm a pragmatist, so I don't think I could, realistically advocate this and hold to some of the positions I hold. But I don't view science in like this abstract, like idealist terms, like science, like throughout all time and all history is this one thing, right? Like I think throughout time, like what science has shifted, right? Like so in the past, like something I brought up previously, something like alchemy was considered a legitimate scientific discipline. As we have continued to develop, as humankind, like we've kind of moved away from that because of the commitments that modern science embraces, right? Like empiricism, testability, repeatability, all of these types of things. But so I would like to actually move on to astrology
Great.
in particular,
Great.
especially like particularly in this modern sense, right? So one of my biggest issues with astrology is that it certainly does. So astrology certainly does make predictive claims about the future. So it has that in common with science, right? However, its claims are typically vague enough to where it's impossible to use it to predict any particular event or events, right? Like you can't, like a astrological reading is never going to say like, oh, you're going to go out and like get hit by a car today, right? It'll say something kind of vague like trouble ahead, right? And that which could be realistically like applied to like any number of scenarios, right? Like either like I stub my toe or something all the way up until like getting hit by a car. And so it's very hard to test or disprove any of these things because they're so vague. They don't typically lend themselves to such tests. And so what adherents of astrology typically do is they'll look for positive evidence of the correctness of their hypothesis. However, they will often ignore or downplay any evidence that might work against that belief, right? That might disprove that disbelief or disprove that belief. And the way science operates seems to be like fundamentally different in this aspect, right? Because scientists have to actively like subject theories to tests that can disprove them. A scientist can't simply point to evidence in favor of a theory and have it be accepted by the community, right? And the reasoning for this is that competing scientific theories can both have mountains of supporting evidence, but be completely contradictory, right? Like, so we can look to a historical example of this in heliocentrism and geocentrism, right? Like, if we were just to look for positive evidence, right? Like, they both like do a decent job at like helping us navigate the Earth and things like that. The geocentric model at the time, when Galileo proposed it, or when Galileo was countering with heliocentrism, was actually better, right?
Sure. We erred on the side of simplicity or beauty, right? I
Well,
guess in that sense, right? We chose beauty over truth in that sense. Right?
well, it's just the positive evidence in favor of it actually supported more of geocentrism, right? Because like it was more accurate.
Right. So
But like both of these,
that was the
but
side
most
of
of these
truth,
theories can.
maybe. So that might have been the side of truth, but we sided with beauty over truth. So we were like, okay, this must be more true because it's more simple and it's more, beautiful to us, rather than, a more complex but technically more accurate model, right?
Well, so but like, anyways, I just wanted to make sure I got this out before we move on. I move on to
Sure.
what you just said. But like both heliocentrism and geocentrism had like all of the same data working in their favor, but they can't both be true, right? Like they're fundamentally different. And that one says the Earth is at the center of the universe, and the other one says that the sun is at the center of our galaxy, right? Like these two things can't be true at the same time. So we, of course, as we know through history, like we stuck with the geocentric model for a time. However, like more and more problems began to arise with this model. We eventually had to shift to this heliocentric model because it was the more simple. Like it ended up having more explanatory power without having to like have like all of these
Right.
caveats, right? Like,
Right. They kept adding epicycles to the old model, right? Like they have like cycles, and then they have the planet on like another cycle that's on the cycle, so it's like going around in a circle while it's going around in a circle. Yeah, in order to explain the retrograde motion of the spheres and stuff.
yeah, and so like after a mountain of evidence like disproving geocentrism comes along, that's when we see the heliocentric model, because it offers that explanatory power, but then it also like passes all those tests that the geocentric model failed. Like that seems to be like where the difference is. Whereas something like astrology or like creation science or something like that is going to look for positive evidence that supports the theory, whereas something we would consider to be a scientific theory has to pass these tests that would necessarily falsify the belief if it failed them, right?
Yes, I might acknowledge that there may be elements of what astrology talks about that would, by purely like a scientism point of view, not be true, like have truth value, or not be things you can talk about strictly. I
Mhm.
would say though that people who study human psychology, and we can think of, I think, these astrological terms as sort of essentially spiritual, right? That like Marsilio Ficino, he would talk about this as speaking about the spirit, which is, it's not your soul, it's not your body, it's your spirit. It's what lies between. And this spirit has certain, it has a psyche to it, right? This is really a psychology. And there are psychological truths here to be one, so that, people like Jung would actually look through these, and write a great deal about alchemy and the sort of psychological journey that it represents. That, taken as purely science, purely an attempt, of sort of a failed attempt at science, it's one thing. But taken as, sort of a whole spiritual journey, representing sort of death, purification, transcendence, sort of reenactment of the fall and redemption, is very sort of Christian or Gnostic Christian idea. Um, Taken this way, it actually has quite a bit of psychological truth to it. So he would talk about how you have to, if you want to be confident, you want to command attention, be like the lion, which is like, a lion has a mane, right, which makes it like the sun. And the sun is also like the sunflower, which follows the sun across the sky. And gold is related to this as well. And the rooster's calls at dawn. All these things are related. And psychically, there is some truth to this, right? There might not be actual relations, but psychically, we can find these relations, and we can play on these relations when we are communing with others and talking to other people. So if I want to be seen as powerful, I might, grow my hair out and have a beard, radiate this sort of lion-like energy. I might wear a lot of gold. I might, dress the part, right? And this sort of effect of, you may say it is a, and I do believe there's psychological literature on this, of sort of believing the part, putting yourself as a role, and then you will feel like that role over time,
Mhm.
and you will sort of you can use these energies and this web of connections and stuff to improve yourself and improve others. That was and win friends and influence people. That was very much Marsilio Ficino's sort of bent to it, almost a self-help sort of model. But there are other ways to interpret these things psychologically. Would you agree?
Certainly. I'm not, like I said at the beginning, I'm not interested in saying like astrology is completely fake, people should just abandon it, or like anything that's not science, right? Like I think there is certainly value in things that are non-scientific. I think something like religious belief obviously like has a very great deal, um, can affect a person's life positively or negatively a great deal in either direction, right? However, I think that trying to say that these things should fall under the realm of science like tends to like degrade both, right? Like if we're going to use it to if we're going to say science is in the business of answering questions of like these psychic connections which we can't like meaningfully measure or like look at, it tends to like lead to like these very reductive understandings of like what we're actually talking about in this like more spiritual
Sure,
realm,
but
right?
wouldn't a psychology, like a perfectly rational psychology, look at these things?
Certainly, but they're not looking, typically something in psychology is not looking to whether like these things are like actually in touch with like God or something, right? Like they're looking to like the effects, they're looking at things that they can actually measure, right? Like what does your example, like wearing gold and like being like the lion, like telling yourself these things, like what measurable difference does that make in your behavior, right? Like that seems to be something that we can actually like measure and look to. Whereas if we're going to say like um what is can we measure what it means to like truly believe yourself to be a lion or something, right? Like the even like social sciences like don't typically like investigate those kinds of questions. They're looking to things that we can actually measure and like look to, or like in some way
Right,
draw like empiric data from.
right. But I mean, uh, doesn't I mean the first thing you said, certainly that seems like a valid sort of psychological endeavor. The idea to look into what is the network of signifiers that we are related in, which ones are associated with confidence, which ones are associated with states of introspection, which ones are associated with states of anger and passion, which ones are associated with states of um what's the fourth one, anyway, like restraint, I guess, and like temperance.
Mhm.
So like, yeah, of those sort of which there are certain signifiers. So if you can, if you're an alcoholic, right, you might depend upon certain signifiers to remind you that you want to not drink again. You might smoke some cigarettes. You might you know do a piece of gum. You might look at a photograph in your wallet, right? And to make them psychically resonant, we might borrow these sort of things. So I think I think there are similar things that we do today um, that are spoken about as these sort of astrological truths. Do you agree to that? No, maybe that we could like if we do the work, we could easily just translate this into a sort of a psychology textbook, or at least some of it. And Jung has already done quite a lot of that work for us, I would say.
I'm not sure I fully grasp what you just said. Would you mind giving me like perhaps
Sure.
another an example or
So like,
something, just to make sure I get
yeah,
it?
yeah. So Jung would talk about like we can get very basic here, but like the idea of the hero cycle, right? We all know
Mhm.
the hero cycle, like the mask with 1,000 faces. You're Luke Skywalker. You're an orphan boy raised in secret. Then you like discover your true destiny. You go off on an adventure. You get some cool weapons and nearly die
Make
a
out
few
with your
times.
sister or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, and then you reach a low point of like, oh no, I'm got my hand cut off. It's my father. I can't kill my father. And then then there's the coming home of the cycle where you heal the wounded father figure and return home and cross the barrier back again. And they're the that's like a million stories. It's Harry Potter, it's all of those things. But that is also the cycle of alchemical like the of transformation. Every metal undergoes the process. So if you're trying to create the Philosopher's Stone, which is symbolically the reinvestment of matter with spirit that it has lost in the fall, what you're doing is you have to disassemble the stone or the material you're working with, give it a sort of a spiritual death, bring it to its low point, and then reconstruct it using these elements once it is sort of symbolically died, and it will be purified of its sort of baser nature, and you'll be able to extract the quintessence, the spiritual mercury from it. And is there not a sense that all technology and technological progress is not sort of driving us towards a kind of singularity, a kind of Philosopher's Stone at the end of history, that the sort of reinvestment of matter with spirit, whether it's we create a giant AI that we all hook ourselves into, or however you want to do it. And is this not sort of fundamentally sort of this astrological hermetic vision, this magical vision?
Well, so what kind of stands out to me here, and I think this might actually get to the root of like what our disagreement on this issue is that I view science as a discipline and like a process that you work through. Like at the end of the day, it's a tool, right? Like it's certainly subject to like to the values of like whatever culture is practicing it. But I don't view science itself as being geared toward like any particular end, right? I don't think that science as a discipline is interested in like reaching this singularity or like taking us through like this hero's journey metaphor that you offered. I view it as just like a tool. Like we can point it in whatever direction we want, but what seems to be what I'm kind of understanding here is you view like this, the direction that science can be used to point to is the same thing as like the process by which we get there, right?
Well, I mean, so I would say that science depends upon certain assumptions. So it depends upon certain assumptions. And then
Which
to
I
just
agree.
go back, I'd also say magic shares this kind of like technical nature. It's also sort of like a tool for doing something. But science shares these certain assumptions. So on the one hand, it has a very empiricist stance about things, that it claims to be, basically only making useful predictions about future experience based upon probability and induction, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not describing the world, I'm just making useful models. That's like the most modest claim that science makes. But on the other hand, it seems to rely on a sort of kind of a realist induction of the world, right? There is some kind of truth there that has emerged through the error of science. So that, the way science progresses is that, one theory, which is, going to turn out to be wrong, will reach contradictions. Those contradictions will provide, another theory, right? The sort of the heliocentric will replace the geocentric model.
Mm-hmm.
But we're not able to, reach the truth. So on the one hand, these are only models, but we can say that, or we want to be able to say that we're able to actually find truth here, right? So on the one hand, these are just useful fictions, but on the other, it seems like you're using these fictions to say this is the only kind of truth that I care about, right? So what?
No, I disagree with that characterization. So I don't think that science is saying like this is the only type of truth we should care about. I think it's saying like this is a very particular type of truth, right? Like this is the way based on like this empiric I almost a journey, but through this empiric like experimentation and like this recording of data, like these are the things that we think we can say, fairly confidently. But it's not, I don't think that's the same as saying like this is the only thing that is true. This is the only thing that matters. Like I said, like I think
Right.
that,
But for
religion
science,
and astrology certainly can help us in that other project. I just view them as being separate projects.
okay. I just like, how would you then view something like, a scientific law? Well, is your notion that that is just something like a habit? Or does a law, in fact, have we discovered a law that then will necessarily say things about the world?
I mean, it's been a while since I've had to talk about this. I think that the way I understand a scientific law is just by us saying that, like, look, we have enough evidence that supports this theory to where, like, we think that this is, true, like under these conditions, like in all cases, right?
Sure. I would say, yeah, I mean, that's very,
That's how I understand a scientific law.
sure, that's a very modest claim. But then to then have something be a law you've now discovered this law, but then to say, oh, but it's like not really a law, maybe, you have this sort of like you're having your cake and you're eating it too sort of thing, where you're saying like we don't know this, haha, but we do actually really know this, but
Well,
we
we know
don't.
it well enough to base models off of that, typically give us outputs that we can predict, right? But if all of a sudden like our conditions like radically change for some reason and like this no longer seems to be true, like I think that's actually a strength of science is that it's able to shift. Whereas something like astrology doesn't seem to have that same strength because it's drawing such vague predictions that it could never be wrong in the first place, right? Like there's never a need for astrology to shift its predictive model because it can never be wrong because of its very nature.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that rather than predict and seek to do predictions, astrology would claim to be, a description of sort of like the metaphysical underpinnings of things, right? And I think that science, can't really claim to do this, but it does do this. So it exists within this framework of like it's grown out of this thing that has said all these things, and it's still saying all of them, but it doesn't maybe realize that it's still saying them, or it tries to not say them, but it is still saying them. So my anyway, so in an astrological sense, metaphysically, things on Earth are conditioned by the heavenly efflusion. So there are these divine chains of influence. The planets, which we see in our materialist conception, are actually, as rocks, are actually these heavenly intelligences. And through them, sort of like the angels, they will deliver the word down, these heavenly efflusions that will, within divine chains, unify all being. So here is like this sort of elaborate metaphysics, and you may, laugh, right? But any scientist is also going to have metaphysical assumptions that they can't defend, right? The difference is that I am upfront with my metaphysical assumptions. And if we look at our metaphysical assumptions, I think they'll be quite similar, like very, like surprisingly similar, to the point where it's kind of eerie in that science is just this outgrowth of uh, Hermeticism and sacred science.
Mm-hmm. Um, so I don't think that similarity, like growing out of a similar place, means that we're the same, right? So like you and I might both have like brown. I obviously don't know what you look like, but like we might both have like brown hair and brown eyes. Be of similar heights, but that doesn't mean that we're the same person, right? So like even if I grant that that something like astrology and like pre-modern science like grow out of similar assumptions, they don't seem to be pointed in the same directions.
Okay. Yeah, I guess I'm saying they share, I guess, similar assumptions that science does depend upon these notions of man as, able to know the world, right? And to speak about, like, whether we can know the world, passively at all, or whether we're always seeing things through our own, lenses, right? So we can see the world in science, but we are, in a sense, only seeing the world that has already been conditioned to us by science, if that makes
Right.
sense.
Yeah, no, I understand. And I completely agree with you. Like, science does have to make some metaphysical assumptions, right? Like, we have to assume that the world exists, for example, and like that we can know things about it.
Right.
However,
So,
like, if
so
we're
I would see, like, overall, in the sense that, we could say that secularism is created not out of the abandonment of religious sentiment, but almost in the intensification of it, right? That, like, no, I hold my, it came out of the religious wars in Europe, right? And it was like, no, I hold my beliefs personally. I'm just going to hold my beliefs, and sort of that intensification of faith created the secular state. I think that science was created almost as a movement within Hermeticism that was anti-superstitious or anti-anthropomorphic. So, if you're familiar with, like, the Greeks, I guess, like, Xenophon made that critique of the gods as anthropomorphic. That he wanted to say that, I think, or maybe it was Xenophanes. Fuck. Anyway, one of these Greek philosophers is going to say that that the gods are too anthropomorphic in in our notions of them. We should move to a less anthropomorphic understanding of the gods, even like a monotheism, and we should sort of cut out this superstition from our beliefs. So, in a sense, this is an intensification of religious faith, in the same way that someone like Spinoza can be viewed as both a pantheist and an atheist, right? The intensification of his spiritual faith made it so that he had to cut out all superstition. And so we could see modern science as this outgrowth of the Hermetic school, that in the name of spirituality and the intensification of that is going to cut out the superstitious elements.
well, I mean, the Enlightenment had something to do with it too, right? Like, this move away from religion, like a shift from engaging purely in like this metaphysical discussion about like what does the universe look like, what does it all mean, into like, well, let's focus on things that we can actually test and like
Well, it seemed like, I mean, on the one hand, yes, I do. I love Kant. I love the Enlightenment, but at the same time, it was sort of the deification of reason, right? This exaltation of reason as the new god. This idea that of humanity and man. I think these things became sort of reified and, like, sort of made magical in the way that these old, we used to believe in God. So now we believe in reason, right? You watch, like, a debate with Sam Harris and Lawrence Krauss and, like, Richard Dawkins, and they're sitting there and they're like, well, empirically speaking, I'm incredibly rational. I was talking to some incredibly irrational people. They were just not rational. And as a rational person, I just couldn't do nothing but scoff upon those irrational people with their feelings or whatever. And, we can see that this view of reason, where we're exalting it as like an idol, is inherently hermetic and astrological, right?
well, right, but I would say that anyone who's doing that is actually failing at the process of like what reason and science are supposed to be, which is this process that you work through. It's not a character trait. Like, rationality is not a thing. Like, you don't say like, I am rational, like that is who I am as a person. Like, no, rationality, reason is a process that you work through. It would be weird to say that a person is rational like at their core, because no, like, what that just doesn't make any sense. So like,
Right.
if anyone, I mean, like Jordan Peterson, whoever, Richard Dawkins, are saying like, I am reasonable, like in the core of my being, and the reason that I can't, like, I think that I agree that they're deifying reason, but I think that they are taking reason like out of what it's supposed to be, which is this process that you work through rather than this character trait or like this idol that you worship at, right?
Yeah, I mean, I do think they are sort of guilty of that. I think sort of the Enlightenment is as well, and I think it comes from this astrological notion, this hermetic notion of reason as the thing that makes us like the divine, right? God made us in his image, as above, so below. We are, and in that we have a mind. We can come to know God's mind and come to know, the true forms about the world, such as, like the physical laws. So, and then from there, we're able to have true knowledge, not from the senses, not from, anything that's, straight from God's mind.
Right, but I would also say that I don't think modern science is necessarily
But this
committed
entire
to
notion of
that
law,
idea of like this ultimate truth that exists outside of time and space, right? Like I don't think I mean, this seems to be like a debate that exists like within scientific circles, right? Like what are the commitments of science? And that seems to be a very live discussion that's going on. Like I don't think we can just say like, well, science is geared toward this thing. Like certainly I agree it makes a lot of metaphysical assumptions, but they're not interested in the idea of like investigating metaphysics. They're interested in engaging in this world of empirics that they're that they're pointed toward. Even if they have to make some metaphysical assumptions to get there, I think it's weird to say that they are engaged in this project of metaphysics, even though they're like explicitly saying that they're not, right? Like they're explicitly trying to move away from that discussion.
right? And I think, I mean, I don't want scientists like, people trying to study a volcano to instead sit home and just write a paper about like epistemology or something like that. And just, I think, if you did that, you'd just be at home. You'd never go and study the volcano. Like we have to go do it. But to do that depends upon certain assumptions, right? Certain ethical
No, I agree.
assumptions, certain value judgments, certain, this whole network of things, right? And I think unconsciously, because of science's history, it has these notions of reason and sort of this hermetic vision of man as knower of the world and as made in God's image and able to know the world. All of these things, which are assumed.
Yeah, and I completely agree with that. Like I said earlier, like science tends to reify like a lot of the morals that exist like in the time and place that science is taking place, right? Like we can look to things like race science and eugenics and things like that. But like at the same time, like that does not mean that that does not mean that we then get to like throw in things like astrology just because like we can point to like historical examples of science being flawed, right? Like that wouldn't seem to follow either.
See, I would say that we can do the work of translating it into modern science, but then there's also perhaps the realm that's not translatable, not commensurate. But
but the reason we moved away from eugenics and things like that is because they were not supported. Like
right.
it's not like we just experienced like this metaphysical shift.
Right, but I mean, it's
point.
also just not a valuable way to look at the world, right? It's like a small-minded and sort of like unbeautiful way. It's not an aesthetic way, because I think ultimately what it's going to come down to is when something is underdetermined, it's going to come down to an aesthetic judgment one way or another, which sort of which set of concepts you're going to use to apply to the individual or the particular experience. So, if you are applying the scientific medium, I mean, and gaining results, I certainly find it valuable to play that language game. But I think that we can't criticize another language game like astrology for not conforming necessarily to the rules or all the rules of science, since there has been this departure, right? And I would say a movement within astrology to sort of purify itself.
Well, right, but I don't think that that's what I'm doing though. Like I'm not saying that astrology and like these other metaphysical projects have no purpose and have no meaningfulness to them. I'm simply saying that they're not science.
Mm-hmm.
I'm simply saying that they are different things, not that
right. So
we should reify science and like, fuck everything else, right? Like I'm not into
right.
scientism.
So so maybe we could just shift like a little at the end. I know we're running out of time, but like towards math a little bit. So, and I love the figure of John Dee, who, for anyone who doesn't know, was
I certainly don't.
the inspiration for 007. He signed his letters to Queen Elizabeth with 007, indicating his spectacles. It kind of looks like that, I guess. And he was a spy for England during this time and worked against the Catholic Church anyway, I'll keep it short. But anyway, he was also the person who set the dates for all of Queen Elizabeth's important functions, because he was the court astrologer. But also he was a mathematician and a scientist and had a huge library. And he did, an incredible amount of work. He had, though, famously, this magical obsidian stone that he carried around that he called a show stone. And when his buddy John, when his buddy, what's his buddy's name? When his buddy looked into it, Edward Kelly, he would see and could talk to angels, and they communicated with angels through this magical stone. You can read you can go see the stone in the British Museum. You can read the diaries about what the angels said. The angels communicated a language to them known as Enochian, the language of Enoch. And this is an actual language. So there are these like tests to see if something is like a language or not. This is legitimately a language. And so they communicated with these angels, and from the angels he learned about higher dimensional mathematics. So the angels communicated to him these like fourth and fifth dimensional geometric shapes, which are part of math today. Now, I know that Bertrand Russell and Whitehead were unsuccessful grounding math in logic, but it seems like 500 years earlier, we have easily grounded it within the sacred knowledge of these angels communicating through a magical stone. So, in the absence of another explanation, I would put to you that, let us just go with this hermetic view, this astrological view that angels, or at least heavenly bodies of great intelligence, are, guiding our way.
And I once again would say that we can certainly acknowledge the influence that things like our belief in angels and all of these other metaphysical beliefs have on our project of science, and I mean mathematics too. Certainly by that example you just gave. However, I don't think we should go as far as to say that science is interested in trying to answer these metaphysical questions, because I don't think that is the best use for what we understand science to be in our everyday lives. So would you like to move on to I guess a summary statement or closing statements or something? I know we're almost out of time.
Yeah, that seems about legit. So I began. Do you want me to? Do you want to go first or last?
I'll go last. You went first, so.
Okay, cool. Yeah. Let me think. All right. So I've certainly had fun here. I want to thank you for this conversation. It's been very civil, and you haven't mocked me openly, so I appreciate that. So I think we do need to see that all knowledge is historical. All knowledge is based on a historical development, and it cannot magically shake itself from this path of historical development. Mathematics, like science, is ultimately perhaps created by man through this historical development, or else discovered in some kind of Platonic sense in the divine mind of God, which would also sort of lend to my view. But let's take we'll go with the idea that it's constructed historically. I think science can't free itself from this notion that it's constructed historically. It can't free itself from this and can only, produce these useful models. Yet it makes claims against our spiritual lives. It offers competing metaphysical claims with religion in large cases. It scoffs at astrology, looks down upon it, says, "Ha, I know, I have science.com. You are a fool." And it makes postures beyond its scope. Now, perhaps science, within a very limited, modest sense, can be justified, and that's a completely adequate view. I think we all use that. We all get into an airplane. Okay. But the matter is undetermined whether we ought to use this scientific worldview or the worldview that everything we see is an illusion. I receive Gnostic information from the mind of God, and with this, I'm able to decode reality. Otherwise, without the right concepts, I'm trapped. I can't decode reality. Reality will forever be an illusion. So the only way knowledge is possible in this view is through this kind of Gnostic knowledge, this occult knowledge, which is handed down in mystery cults from master to pupil, master to pupil. Each generation has the task of taking this dead thing, letting it die, and then birthing it to life once again. This is the process of transmutation that occurs, creation of the Philosopher's Stone, which I've suggested is the point at the end of history to which we are all being drawn. I think that these views as a psychology, this idea of wearing gold, or you can have your deepest thoughts at midnight. That's the time. That's the time you have your deepest thoughts. Not at 4 p.m, not right after dinner. No, at midnight. That's the hour when the hour is darkest. Right? You have your deepest introspective thoughts. These ideas are powerful psychologically. They do contain within them a certain wisdom about how our mind makes connections between things, and they can provide us with a sort of psychological benefit, even if you admit that there's no mechanism there. Simply faking it till you make it, or thinking there's a benefit and having a placebo effect because you're wearing your favorite gold earrings, you're feeling confident. Those all have scientific benefits. So I think following these practices do, in fact, have sort of workable truths in them, as outlined by Jung. We didn't get so much into Jung, but he would spend a long time dealing with alchemy and treat it seriously as a topic. So I guess I would conclude with, just thanking you for the debate, and the idea that we can all, in this undetermined state, we're going to have to pick our worldview based upon unrational or irrational means. It's going to be a matter of passion or choice, not reason. You can choose science because it's useful to you. You deem this not useful, but this could be still true, and science could be completely wrong. Irrational, I think I tried to say. I may have slurred. Anyway, that's my closing statement. Thank you so much for debating.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess I'll start off by saying, echoing your thanks. I appreciate this conversation. I've had a lot of fun here. I would also like to thank everyone who was listening. I hope we gave you a decent exchange of ideas to listen to. So I guess I'll start off by saying that the proposition that we face today is astrology. Can astrology realistically be defined as a science? I feel that I've given you several reasons as to like why we necessarily should not lump them in under the same umbrella, right? So I've given you the idea of Karl Popper's idea of falsifiability. So like, whereas something like astrology typically makes these prescriptions that are so broad and vague that they could apply to seemingly anything. Whereas something in a scientific sense, like there has to be a test that could realistically prove it wrong for it to be considered science, right? Now I'll repeat that I don't disagree with my fellow interlocutor that science is limited, right? Like science certainly does tell us a lot about the world. It's enabled us to develop technologies that we might not have otherwise developed, right? Had we stuck with other forms of what used to be considered science, like alchemy and things like that. But like it can't tell us like what is meaningful in our lives, right? Like usually the type of work science does is going to echo like what we already think is valuable, right? Like we think that a two-parent household is like ideal for like raising a child or something, right? Like we measure this and like make these comparative analyses because we already kind of believe that. However, I don't think that saying that we come into science and we engage with science in this cultural sense means that we can say that like these metaphysical questions are the same thing as science, right? So an unintended consequence of considering something like astrology to be like a scientific endeavor is that we suddenly have to like contend with things like creation science as well, right? Because they make similar, and whereas like astrology doesn't do this, creation scientists like actively try to present themselves as scientists, right? And so if we are suddenly going to concern ourselves with a lot of these metaphysical concerns, it becomes a lot harder to keep out these things that we obviously consider to be pseudoscience, right? Things like creation science, things like flat earth science, right? That becomes an issue. So this debate seems to have shifted at a certain point to be about like, well, what are the limits of science? Well, astrology and like these metaphysical disciplines kind of answer where science leaves us off. But the question we're really supposed to be concerned with is like, are science and astrology like one and the same? Like, should we think of them in the same breath? I argue no, and I feel that I've laid out a decent enough case as to why you should not consider astrology to be a science either. It can certainly be valuable in its own right, in its own arena. I just think that these are fundamentally separate arenas for the reasons that I've listed out to you for past hour or so. And I think I am done. So thank you so much.
So thank you for that debate. Yeah, that was great.
Yeah, great debate, guys. I really enjoyed that.